Hello and welcome to Pod Street, the Writing WA podcast where we talk to authors, illustrators and creatives from all over the state. I'm Laurie Steed, the Partnerships and Development Manager for Writing WA, and today we're delighted to welcome Chene Marrapodi. Chene Marrapodi is an Australian writer, journalist and podcaster. She's worked in media for many years, currently for Channel 9 News and formerly as a reporter for Channel 7's Today Tonight, as well as online news and radio. Chene's love of words is rivaled only by her love of dance. Her books, One Wrong Turn and Breaking Point, are the perfect combination of the two. Chene, welcome to Pod Street.
Thanks for having me, Laurie.
You're welcome. Now, Chene, you're also the host of the Writers Off the Page podcast. How does it feel to be on the other side of the microphone?
You know, I always get really uncomfortable because as a journalist, it's always me asking the questions and I'm in complete control, and same as podcasting. And when you're on the other side, there's this vulnerability that you never really know what is either going to be asked or what's going to come out of my mouth. And it's just a bit of a gamble.
Well, I'll try and be as considerate as possible and hopefully answer interesting questions while not being too sort of hard edge. I'll go for the lighter Today Tonight story versus the hard running down the street following the dodgy politician. That's what I'll do.
Thank you. Look, we're talking books, so I think we're pretty safe.
We should be safe. So obviously you have had a long and illustrious career in the media. So where did you study and what did you learn on the job that sort of took you towards your job at Today Tonight?
It was a bit of a funny one because I knew I wanted to be a journalist from quite early. I actually, as a kid, wanted to be an author, and bless the adults in my life told me it wasn't really a thing you did as a career. It was a hobby. So then it turned to what can I do that involves writing and storytelling, and then journalism was the natural progression. And I did an undergraduate at UWA, which isn't typically a journalism-based school, but I studied Italian and I wanted to be able to keep on doing that. And then I moved to Italy for a little while, and then I came back, and to actually enter the industry in journalism, I had to do a postgraduate at ECU in broadcasting, which is the TV and radio side of things. And everything just timed in a really, really, I guess, particular way where I was quite lucky. I started off with WA Today as their video journalist, and for a year I was filming, editing and writing my own stories for the website, which I don't think that role actually exists, definitely not in Perth anymore. And then after a year I got picked up by Today Tonight. So It was, I think timing was a little bit unheard of. I fell on my feet. I worked really hard to get there, but things lined up really, really well.
And how different is your current role as a producer to the reporter role?
They kind of overlap a little bit, and very rarely I will still get on the tools and report, or I'll write a story and just voice it in the newsroom if we're under the pump. But mostly I'm producing now, so I'm helping the reporters, I guess, shape their stories and making sure they're thinking about everything that they need to be including to make sure it's a well-rounded story, to make sure we're not coming into any legal issues. I'm editing their scripts and I guess giving them some guidance with their wording. And there's really, working in the newsroom now, I see even more just how much of a team effort it is to put the news to air each night. It takes a lot of people to put each story together, and I love being part of it.
Well, I don't know if you know, but I did study journalism a long time ago, about 20 years ago.
And one of the things, know.
Yeah, at Murdoch. And one of the things that struck me that my university lecturer used to say to me is I'd tell him of a story idea I had, and then he'd always get a slightly suspicious look in his eye, and he'd say, make it newsy. So what makes it newsy? Because I clearly didn't have that instinct of like what was a newsy story versus what was a bog standard story.
I have always used, and I don't know if this is the exact answer that a uni lecturer would give or a news director would give, but my guide has always been it has to be something that people are going to care about. The people at home have to be affected by it in some way or another. That's what makes it newsworthy, rather than a show and tell of what's happening like we used to do at school. Yeah. And if it is a very niche story that only affects one person, well, it has to be so extraordinary that people will still stop and watch because they haven't heard it before. Otherwise, it has to be something that someone could reasonably say at home, oh my goodness, this is going to affect me, or wow, imagine if that was mum or dad.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And so you said that you did want to be a writer prior to taking up your journalism. Were you planning to write the sort of stories you write now or different kinds of things?
I don't know if I had anything in particular in mind as a kid. To be honest, I'm now going out and talking to kids at schools. I've been thinking about it a lot more because I've still got some of the books that I wrote when I was about 10, 11 years old. And I take them and I show them. And talking about them more makes me think about it more. And I think as a kid, I just wrote the books that I wanted to read.
Mm,
And sometimes I forget about that now. So it's nice telling kids that because it kind of puts it back in my head of, hey, if you want to do this job properly, you need to write the book that you want to read. So for me as a kid, it was a book called The Rebel Riders that really was
okay.
this amalgamation of the Saddle Club and the Famous Five, girls that solved mysteries on horseback.
I
And
love
no
that.
surprise, that's what I was reading at the time.
Yeah, yeah,
And so
yeah.
I kind of merged the two together and wrote this book so that I could be a part of the action. And now I probably, when I was first working as a journalist, thought I would write for adults, but
Mm,
I don't know what happened. I just very naturally fell into writing for that middle grade age bracket. And I think that's because that was the age I was when books meant the most to me,
mm.
when they really affected my life. And I was kind of making sense of what was going on around me based on the books that I was reading. And also, I'm living the adult life. I don't need to
Yeah.
write about the highs and lows of being an adult. I see it every day. So kids are much more fun.
I reckon that's a great way of putting it. And I guess the other interesting thing that we haven't touched on is that I'm guessing at a relatively young age you discovered dance as well. When did you first start that journey?
I think I was about 5 or 6, and I know I'd begged mum for a really long time to let me take up dancing. And she was kind of the opposite of your typical dance mum in that she had really briefly danced as a child and felt like she'd missed out because she hadn't got to continue. So instead of kind of pushing it onto me, she was paranoid of doing that. So she made me really beg for it to make sure that I really wanted to go. She wasn't forcing me. And then she enrolled me and made the comment of, if you ever complain about going to class, you'll be right out of there. You're done. And lo and behold, I never complained. I just increased and increased, and the bill got bigger and bigger every term. And I still, to this day, not as much at the moment because I am pregnant and also running around after a toddler, but I will go to an adult class here and there because I think once you start dancing, you don't really stop.
So, what is it about, as someone who is like traditionally uncoordinated, what does dance look like when it's done well? What do you need to consider to perform well in the field of, say, ballet or jazz?
You know, I think at its heart, it's storytelling as well. And I
Mm,
always talk to kids about that. And I'm like, there's three things that I really love in life more than anything else aside from my family. And that's books, journalism, and dance or ballet. And they all have one thing in common, and that's storytelling, because dancers can tell an entire story without saying a single word. And I find that pretty cool. And I think if I'm watching a dance, the dancers that I love the most are those ones that are telling a story. And I
mm,
think that's just so powerful that our bodies can do that through movement. But more than that, it was always just a social and a fun thing for me to do. And now as an adult, I hate going to the gym. I really loathe it. Whereas if I go to a dance class, I know I'm going to get an incredible workout. But because of the music and the fun side of it, I can just pretend that I'm not
mm.
exercising, that I'm just doing something that's just
That it's
pure joy.
actually fun in the first place. Yeah,
Yeah.
you can't do that at a gym. Like, it's
No,
very
I
clear.
just, people smiling while they're exercise, I just don't understand it.
And so obviously that dancing has also led you to two wonderful books now. One Wrong Turn, already published, and Breaking Point, which is due out to be published next week and available for pre-order. And you have these two characters, Amelia and Valentina. Talk us through a bit about those two characters and if you feel an affinity for one over the other or both, or how you came to create that world.
Well, Amelia was always there. She was there from the very first draft, and she is a really hardworking, dedicated student. She's a little bit prickly. She comes across as prickly, and it's not because she's rude or she doesn't like people, and I really hate that people tend to team cattiness with dancing, and I just did
Mm,
not want that in my books at all because it's not something that I've really experienced. I've
come
had my
across.
best
Yeah.
friends at dance schools. Um, but it's because Amelia is just so focused on becoming a professional dancer that she kind of has tunnel vision and she compartmentalizes, and it's very much she doesn't understand how she can have friends and have fun at a dance school and still take it seriously. She hasn't learnt that balance. And she actually formed, not because I was like that myself, but because sometimes, particularly when I was dancing competitively still as an adult while I was at uni or while I was working full time as a journalist, and fitting in dancing and the rehearsals and things like that was so hard that sometimes I'd get really frustrated when I'd hear people talking in class, because I'm like, come on, we've got a tight time frame to do things. We just need to get it done. And having that thought process, I thought, oh, imagine if there was a kid that was like that, that was just, that's all that they wanted. So she was always on the page, and she kind of was a lot of fun to write because she was such an exaggeration of that feeling. And she would think things that I would never really think. So it was kind of fun to just go wild. And Valentina, she was a funny one because originally when I wrote One Wrong Turn, it was called Bunheads because people nickname ballet dancers bunheads because of the bun in their hair. And she was actually a secondary character. And I wasn't connecting as much with the other main character. But every time Valentina, who was called Lottie at the time, was on the page, she was just really loud. And she had this Italian heritage, and I just loved it whenever she came into the story. And the first book, actually, the first draft, as you know, it wasn't the first draft that I submitted, but the first version of Bunheads, or One Wrong Turn, as we'll say, was rejected. And I, before it was rejected, had already started rewriting it. And I was speaking to the team at Fremantle Press, and I had made a comment that I was like, oh, was it that main character? I don't know if I really connected to her properly. Her family was really different to mine. And I said, but that secondary character, Lottie, and Kate Sutherland, who was the editor at the publisher at Fremantle Press, said, oh, I loved her. Every time she was on the page, I wanted more of her. And I said, well, that's really great because I've started rewriting this with her as the main character along with Amelia. And instead of just at the time, she had Italian heritage that was very similar to my own. So she had grandparents that were Italian and an extended family, but she herself was Australian. And I said, just to kind of up the stakes a little bit, I've made her an Italian migrant instead because my whole family migrated from a tiny town in the south of Italy that's very traditional. It's got a lot of colour when we visit it. And it's not uncommon for people to leave the tiny town and come to Australia, the land of opportunities, as we say, to kind of start a better life. And I thought, that kind of gives her a little bit of interest. And although I myself haven't migrated from Italy, I lived in Italy for a while. And I danced while I was over there. I know what it's like to find your feet in a new country and to have language barriers and things like that. So it all just wrote itself very easily. When I put her in that main character position, I had to change her name from Lottie because the tiny town that my family is from is very, very traditional, and there's only a handful of male and female names that are used. So there's lots of double ups, and Lottie is 100% not one of them. Chene is not one of them. My name was very controversial. So she became Valentina because I didn't have a family member called Valentina, but it's very true to the region.
Yeah,
so it was a safe bet, and it just kind of wrote itself from there. And her family is probably the greatest joy, other than the dance, the greatest joy I get with writing these books because I've seen them in various aspects of my life. They're not one person, they're not based on an individual, but they just bring together the character traits of so many people I know. So they just feel so real, and the things that they do. Her house is very similar to my nonna's house that was here. So I can picture it very, very clearly, and I think it's that nostalgia for me when I write it.
Beautiful. And look, one of the interesting things you raised there is that, so at the point of the publisher not wanting the book at that time, you engaged in discussion to go, well, what would take it to that point? And that's actually not always the case. So sometimes a writer will go, oh, they don't want it. Well, they can go whatever and take it in quite an upset place. So what was it about either your attitude or your sort of upbringing that made you go, look, I feel like there's an opportunity here, even though I'm at the point of no right now?
I think there's two things. One is I was kind of in a fortunate position because you mentioned I had the podcast. I had already had casual conversations with Fremantle Press, so not about my books, but it kind of gave me that avenue of when it was rejected, I could at least have a conversation at the end of it. A lot of people either don't hear based on a rejection or they get the generic email. And
Sure.
there are now lots of other publishers that I wouldn't be able to have that conversation with. But because I had had an in-person conversation informally with Fremantle Press, I felt like I could just at least ask the question. Secondly, it's a bit of a blessing and a curse. I just don't take no for an answer. Not necessarily, like, I'm very accepting that if they don't want it, they don't want it. But I am always very self-critical and I want to see, okay, well, I've put a lot of time and effort into this. It would kill me more if it just sat in a drawer and didn't see the light of day. So what can I do to make it better? And because I had had that niggling about that main character not working, it wasn't this is subjective, I'm just going to send it to somebody else and see if they like it. I never wanted to get a book published that I had my own doubts about.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make it strong enough that at least if one publisher said no, I had the confidence to say, okay, but I really love this story, so I'm going to send it elsewhere. So I still haven't probably got that balance. And I think journalism is partly to blame because journalism is such a brutal industry. No one minces their words. You're told very, very quickly if something is good, bad, if it needs to be scrapped, whatever it may be. Whereas, as you know, publishing is not that. And you don't often get that feedback. And so anytime things have been rejected, I have just really turned kind of internal about it and gone, okay, well, what's the problem here? What am I missing? Rather than just, I never want to be arrogant and think, okay, no, my work's the best it can be. I'm just going to keep sending it. So I probably overwork things now and just never really trust that they're there if people say no. But hopefully eventually I'll find that balance.
No, well, look, I think it actually puts you into a positive framework in the sense that, and I don't know, but potentially getting the immediate feedback on stuff in journalism means that a publisher's no feels a little softer by comparison. So some authors have only had that.
Though, because this is a lot more personal than journalism has ever been. So
that's true.
Particularly because of the wait time. I once got rejected by an agent and it was within, I think, 48 hours. And that no didn't hurt because it was quick. But because everything moves at a glacial pace, drawing it out, and sometimes you're waiting 6 months, 10 months, like I'm an overthinker. So in that time, I've become so emotionally invested in this response that it does hurt when things don't work, particularly when I do feel like they're good enough. But I have got to a point where I'll give myself kind of a day and a half of just wallowing and being depressed about it. And then I kind of give myself a bit of tough love. And I'm like, okay, if you want this to go, you need to get yourself up, get back into it. I once deleted a whole book by accident when I was about 3/4 of the way through a rewrite, and that made me have a mental breakdown. But by that night, I'd started rewriting it because I was like, well, what am I going to do if I'm just going to cry and give up and walk away? Or we just move on. The longer I leave this, the harder it's going to be to get back to it. So don't think about it anymore. Shut off and do it.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's always healthy, Laurie, but it seems to work.
Well, I guess it's almost like the industry is what it is. So to sort of, it would be like being angry at rain for making you wet. Like the industry will do what it does. Oh, look, it's going to happen. But I guess rain is rain and the publishing industry is the publishing industry. So I think sometimes we forget that it's a choice. It's a choice that's loaded by the impulse to write, but it is still a choice to go, I want to publish my work. I want to be traditionally published. Thus, I need to care about what all these people think and if they think it's publishable or not. And you can still go back to yourself and go, I still think this is a really good book and I'll work it out myself. It's just that the nature of it is submission. Like I often think of submission as a dual meaning word, like you submit the work, but you submit to all kinds of craziness. You're like, okay, I submit.
So much craziness.
So much.
And you hear, I differ from a lot of authors and writers, and I know that there are a lot of people in the industry that wouldn't like me saying this, that say, you write for yourself, you write because it brings you joy, you don't worry about if it published. Well, I've never felt like that. I'm very much of the mindset that if I'm going to give up time to do something, writing Bunhead started while my little one was about 6 months and I was so sleep deprived, and it was during his naps that I was doing it. And I always just felt like if I was giving up a nap myself, a cup of tea, that moment of sanity to write, it had to see the light of day. And it didn't mean that it had to see the light of day overnight, but it meant that I was going to do everything that I could, whether it took a year, 2 years, to get it published, because personally I needed that validation. I needed it to go somewhere. And I know that people are like, oh, but that's not the right reason to write. Well, that's my reason. I like to have something to hold at the end of the day.
I like that. And I guess getting back to your two books, so obviously you're middle grade, that's the right term
yes,
for...
middle grade for that 9 years plus age bracket.
So what are their key obsessions and interests in your experience, the kids of this age? Like, what do you find about their identity, where they're at, and that kind of stuff when they come across your books?
Well, I think it obviously varies child to child, but my books, I think, are kind of almost, some reviewers have coined them upper middle grade or lower YA. They're kind of for that child that wants something that's a little bit meatier than your junior fiction, smaller novels, but they're not quite ready for the themes of young adult yet. They don't want the drugs, sex, and rock and roll. Yeah. They just need something that's G-rated, but that makes them feel like they're reading something mature. And that was the type of reader that I was as well. I wanted something that had substance to it. So the dance books, for me, there wasn't a lot of ballet dance books in the market, and there hadn't been since from when I was a little girl, to be honest with you. And the ones that were out there were beautiful, but they were very much tutus, tiaras, glitz and glamour of dance. And occasionally the cattiness came in. And I was like, this is not dance to me. Dance is athleticism. There's friendship in there. There's teamwork. People often underestimate teamwork in dance. And I really wanted to show that as much as a soccer team can have, a dance team can have that as well. It really takes a whole group to pull something together. And so I wanted to validate the feelings of the kids that are in that age bracket to kind of feel seen as dancers and go, yes, this is what we're doing. When people think we're just prancing around at a ballet bar, this is what we're doing. We're working really hard. And I never want to talk down to kids. I want them to have so much fun reading my books that it makes them want to read another book. But I also want them to go, oh, good, this really saw me. This challenged me. I don't want to use simple words because I think, I'm not going to riddle it with complicated language. But if a child's that invested in a book that they can either read around the word and keep going and understand what it means, or if they really want to, they can grab a dictionary and it's not going to deter them. And I've got Italian in this book as well and dance terms. And I always am trying to kind of write around those so it doesn't stop the story, but it makes the kids kind of think they've got this secret language in there that they're trying to decode as well.
Yeah. And I love also, I guess, to me, a meta message is this one of resilience and balance. And so I was interested, you've been in that dance space and I grew up around competitive sports. I know for my own children, there's always that real danger of black and white thinking like, but I didn't win. Thus I lost, and things like that. So what kind of message would you like to get across to your readers about how one achieves success and what success even looks like?
Well, I think for me, it was just that idea of if you want something really badly, you work hard to achieve it. And it's very similar to how I approach my writing. Dance writing, it doesn't matter what it is in life. If I want something, I'm going to put in the yards to eventually achieve it. And so with dance, it's been no different. I was never that dancer that won first place with everything. I occasionally won things, but a lot of the time I'd go to competitions just because it was fun, because I loved my dance and the social side of things. But I worked really hard and I wanted kids to see that things don't happen overnight. It's always good to have a long-term goal and you keep pushing towards that. Never feel ashamed for a goal that you've got. I think now we are building kids up and adults up to be really confident, but there always is this little disclaimer that comes. Like when I wanted to publish a book, I felt like I had to say, oh, I'm writing this book. It might not get published, and I just had to throw that in like a buffer. Like, I've got this lofty dream, but don't worry, I'm being realistic. And it's great to be realistic, but we shouldn't limit ourselves either. So the characters in these books are so driven. They really want to succeed, to become professional dancers when they're older, not now. But they're kind of putting the foundation, those stepping stones in place to secure the potential of a career in the future. And so, yes, they're competing in One Wrong Turn. They're competing for lead roles. Breaking Point, they're kind of up against some bigger challenges outside of dance that are affecting them on the dance floor. And all of those things are kind of making it harder and harder, but they're all driven enough to kind of keep on pushing. And I just love that idea that, yeah, it's not going to be easy, but you just got to keep going, keep the big picture there when you can.
And is that what would help yourself, or you think any rider, in a time of limbo? We are talking about very long-term goals. So I guess the challenge is that there will be times when nothing is happening other than the work. So I guess I'd be curious as to whether, and that might be talking about things like social media as well, but what advice you would give to an emerging rider who wants to get their first book published, how you find focus and clarity and self-compassion to keep going.
I think it's always having that long-term goal in mind and setting up as well, okay, do you want to be traditionally published? Are you happy to go down the self-publishing route? That's something that for me, I don't have the confidence to do that. I need a team to kind of get me there at the end to make sure that I'm dotting all my I's and crossing my T's. But once you've got that big goal, okay, well, it's one thing to say, I want to write a book, I want to publish a book. What do you actually have to do to get there? And like I said to you, I mean, we're all a little bit bashful about saying that we've got these goals, but declaring that you've got a goal isn't saying that you expect it to happen tomorrow. It's saying that you are going to get there eventually, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10. I've heard of people that have been writing for 10, 15 years and then got their first contract. And God, imagine the feeling of knowing that all of those years has finally paid off. And so for me, when I decided to take it seriously, I started looking at, okay, what are kind of some things I can put in place to actually make that happen, to make sure it's not just a lofty goal, that I'm heading in that direction. It was committing to writing regularly and taking it seriously rather than thinking of this is just a hobby, I'm being selfish going into my study to write. No, this is something that I'm taking really seriously. So by giving up an hour here, half an hour sometimes to keep it moving, well, that's fair. I knew I needed to network in the industry. And for me, that was podcasting because I love a chat, Laurie, but I'm a little bit of an introvert. I won't openly go up to somebody at an event and just start a random conversation. I like to have a purpose. So if I was getting to put on my reporter hat and ask questions and approach people for an interview for my podcast, then I had a purpose and I was fine. It wasn't just a, hi, I'm Chene, let's start a chat. So I did that. And that way I could also research the industry and know, okay, if I want to get published, it's not just one draft. This is how a lot of people edit. This is the steps they take. They might do writing assessments. They might do boot camps, workshops, things like that. They submit in this way. I like to research, and I probably over-research, but I feel like then I'm kind of laying the groundwork so that eventually the dream will happen.
Oh, I think that's great advice, because I think one of the things that happens is people get focused on the achievement, and to get to the achievement or to sort of fill that time, one of the great things about something like a podcast is you're learning all the time. And this is something that's serving a purpose for connections and things like that. But you're also learning more about the industry and you're belonging more in the industry. So I think that's the other thing that writers sometimes miss is they're like, I'm here, make me a star. And it's like, well, there's a bunch of people who want to do this and some people who really love doing this. Why not be part of that? And then when your time comes, it's your time. And in the meantime, you're there with other people's time and part of this greater, I don't know, culture within the city and the state. I certainly think I'm really impressed by your ability, one, to find a type of book that wasn't there. And then now that it's there, it seems like a no-brainer that it would be there. So I really admire that you found a niche. Yeah, look, I think so. And I also love that you write for children at quite a pivotal age as they're trying to work out who they are and what they want to be. So it's been a joy to talk with you. And thank you so much, Chene, for being on Pod Street.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.